Welcome back to Behind the Title. I'm one of your co-hosts, Bobbie Grenier.
And I'm Jessica Bedell Mongue.
We're happy to have you back, Jess. I always feel like the holidays are such a busy time in title because, let's face it, we like to party a little bit. We like to get together with our clients and wrap up a great year usually.
So true. It was a very busy holiday season and even into January, but I've missed you guys.
Well, I've missed you too. And we're doing this episode by Zoom because we just have not been able to work out schedules, but that's okay. The good news is that we're back together and we're back with another episode of Behind the Title.
Today's episode is going to be focused on why closings are emotional, even when everything goes right.
Yeah, it's really tough because it is a business transaction, but there are so many emotions wrapped up in it and on so many different levels. So we're going to kind of unpack that, talk to you all about what we see as the process goes through in title and closing. So what do you think the number one thing is, Jess, that brings the emotion into a real estate transaction?
I think we are all very aware that anything involving money, especially a very large sum of money, brings a whole lot of emotions into anything that we're doing, right? A closing is generally one of the biggest purchases that somebody is going to make in their lifetime. So you can understand how that is going to potentially bring a customer through a roller coaster of emotions as they go through the process.
I was speaking with a real estate agent one day, and she kind of put it in perspective for me as far as the money goes, because you first have upfront your closing costs. And even before closing costs, you have to pay for an inspection for the most part. If you opt to have the property you're looking to purchase go through a building inspection, that money is out there and it can be $1,500. So that money is the first part. And then they have to start thinking about closing costs. But then if you're taking out a mortgage, that financial obligation doesn't go away. I think that the long-term effect can be very overwhelming. And I think that a lot of times people get pre-approved and they're celebrating and everything's great. But then it sort of sits and settles in that this is a very long-term financial obligation that they're committing to.
Absolutely. I always joke at the closing table. I think in some ways it should be illegal for customers to have to sign the amortization schedule because it's like so shocking to people to have it in very black and white that these are all of the payments and all of the interest and all of the principal that you were going to pay potentially over the lifetime of that loan. So it's always kind of a joking point when I get to that document in the closing, because I'm like, don't look at these pages too hard. Let's just get through this and then you can focus on what that all means after the fact. So you're right.
I tend to show them the first page, and like you said, this is the payment date and the total payment, what goes to principal, what goes to interest. And then I very quickly flip to the last page, usually where the signature line is. And it's like, this is the happy ending. This is when you have a party. This is when you celebrate. You've paid your mortgage off. Now, as we know, most people don't go their full term before they sell or refinance. But at that moment, they are looking at, a 15, 20, 30-year mortgage ahead of them. So I think that it can be very overwhelming with the financial aspect of it.
So let's talk about some other emotional takeaways throughout the process.
I think that one of the big things that I find, and you can tell me if you agree, is all of the information that is coming at them. The overwhelm of information. Again, if they're working with a lender, so they're talking to the lender, their real estate agent is giving them information. Maybe they're getting that report in from the building inspector, and then title comes in with all kinds of information that we need in order to process the file. So once they've picked the house and their offers has been accepted, they're on that high. A lot of work starts at that point.
Like you said, there's so much information that's coming from all sides of the transaction. And especially for folks that have never been through the process, it can seem extremely overwhelming. And to be honest, we still have your day-to-day job, family, pets' responsibilities that you're also juggling on top of potentially packing, getting ready to move, and all of these things. So, yeah, we live a very busy lifestyle, I think, generally. And so, adding in all of this extra kind of paperwork and information and timelines, too, right, can be very anxiety provoking.
It's a lot. It's a lot. And I say this again and again, but we're doing this in our day to day. And sometimes it might be lost on us, all of the different information that the buyers and the sellers are, as well, are being asked to provide, and timelines and deadlines, and getting everything done so we can meet that closing date that's on the contract. Let's talk about sellers for a minute, though, because there are a lot of emotions tied up a lot of times in selling a home or selling a property.
Absolutely. And I feel like I'm seeing it more and more within the last couple of years, but having sellers that have owned and lived in the same house for 20, 30, even more years, there's so much history and memories that are tied up in a home when you have spent that long in one place. So it can be very emotional, even if it's for good reasons that, they're selling and moving on. But to kind of close that chapter and open a new one definitely can bring some tears and other feelings at the table and throughout the process, I'm sure.
I have been in my house for a little over 30 years.
Wow.
And yeah, yeah. And my husband and I talk about selling and, building something smaller as our kids have grown and moved out. But I get very, very sad when I think about it. I know it's the practical thing, but I get really sad when I think about it. So I can totally get that, as I'm kind of wrestling with that in my own mind. And I think that as people pack, they're packing up the house, they're packing up momentums, photos, they're packing up, videos back before we all had video cameras on our phones. And they're really sort of reliving their time in that home. And it's very emotional. And the thought of somebody else coming in, and you really want someone to love your home. You don't have any control over it, but you're really just hoping that it's a great home for the next person that comes along.
Absolutely. And also, there are instances where people maybe have to sell not because they want to, right? Unfortunately, I had a transaction recently where the sellers were retired and the town that they lived in had recently increased their property taxes. They had done a reassessment and revaluation, and the taxes went up to such a level that they were not going to be able to sustain retirement in that home, which they had built and lived for over 30 years. They just couldn't afford it. So you have also all of these elements that are potentially out of your control, right? Those situations where people have to sell that are not necessarily for what they feel is the betterment of their life or for a good reason. So that was very, very difficult for those individuals. And my heart really was feeling very heavy for them to have to walk away from that home that they loved and cared about so much because of that situation. So it's difficult no matter what, I think, whether it's for happy, good, positive reasons or for other reasons. It's you're attached to the things, the familiarness of all of it.
As we live in Maine, we have an aging population. So we are seeing so many estate sales. So children that are selling homes on behalf of their parents that have passed. And that also makes it really tough. And we go into this closing and we have our file folder and our, pens and our notary stamps and everything. But we're human beings. And I am really, oh, if it's horrible or if it's good, I'm not really sure. I haven't decided. But if I see somebody tearing up or crying, I instantly do. So I definitely have cried in closings with sellers that are selling, mom's house or grandma's house and letting that go.
Agree. And it's important for us to, have that empathy for them during the closing. I think it's very easy to ride the line of wanting to feel professional, but also almost feeling soulless, if you don't have a moment and let people have a moment to grieve or to, let out how they're feeling throughout the process. And it's completely natural, we're more than just paper shufflers, right? Like this is a human experience and a really big important part of people's lives. So I personally think that, it's nice that you're able to connect with people in that way, Bobbie, and it feels a little less transactional, to have an individual that's conducting the closing that also can understand and share in that.
So the tissues on the closing table are not just for the clients. I think another issue or another feeling that a lot of both buyers and sellers have, probably more on the buyer's side, is there's such a buildup. They're in transactional mode. So they're getting their list done. They're making sure their appraisal is done. They're doing everything that their lender requires of them, that their agent has asked them to do. So they are going from thing to thing to thing. So when they have a moment to stop, and that's usually right before the closing, and sort of absorb and resonate with everything that they've been dealing with, that's when I find people tend to get more emotional.
I'd agree with you for sure, because when you're super busy, I think it's very easy for us to just kind of forget, right? You're not getting caught up in the moment, or you don't have time to actually process what's going on because it's just a flurry. It's a whirlwind. You're moving from one thing to the next. But when you pump the brakes and have time to stop and take it all in, it's like, wow, this is a really big deal and it's coming to an end. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, good or bad or overwhelmed or what it may be, right?
As real estate professionals, what's your advice, Jess, to help our clients make this a little less emotional, or at the very least, give them the best support that we can when we get to that? Well, throughout the whole closing process, but for you and I, when we get to that closing table.
Yeah, I think for me, if I see somebody struggling or needing 5 minutes, I'll stop and ask if they need to take a break, go grab a glass of water or something. But I also try and prep people to have a drink, grab a snack prior. Sometimes just having something to distract yourself with for a couple of seconds, take a breath, get a bite to eat, because maybe you haven't eaten that morning, honestly. And then by the time you get to the closing table, you're like, I'm hangry, So I'm starting to feel some sort of way. I want this over with, right? So I think we do a very good job at trying to make everybody feel comfortable and provide all of the creature comforts that maybe you might not have had a second to even give yourself the day of closing, right? Because it's just been mayhem, especially if people are moving on the same day. I always ask folks, Bobbie, at the closing table, when are you actually moving in? And I'm hearing a lot of customers tell me that, oh, we have a couple more weeks or even to the end of this month. And I just think that that's fantastic to give yourself the flexibility to not have to pack up, move out of one place, have your stuff basically in limbo, do a walkthrough, come to the closing, then go and get it all unpacked. Like, it's just a lot. And if you've never done it before, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into when it comes to doing that full process in a day. For our seasoned sellers that are purchasing and they've done this, they know all fair and well what they're doing. So, you'd hope that at that point they'll be doing anything that they can to make their lives a little bit easier if they've been through the process a couple of times. But for our first-time home buyers, they just don't know what they don't know. So I think it's such a breath of fresh air. And I feel like that comes from good realtors advising and like looking at the timelines and saying, well, give yourself 2 extra weeks. You've already paid for this month of rent anyways, or you don't need to get out of mom and dad's house the same day. I think that that's just great advice for anybody. Also, I think if you have the funds, hiring some help is such an easy and stress-free way to like just take a couple of things off of your plate during a very hectic time.
I think people also underestimate what time it takes to pack a home or to unpack a home. I have had sellers that have come in, a wash of sweat, and they're in their, working clothes, and they apologize because they literally have been putting the last few boxes in their car on their way to the closing. So, if at all possible, just try to give yourself extra time, even if you didn't need it. That's absolutely the best way to do it because, in that walkthrough, that can cause some issues with your closing if you don't have everything packed up and cleaned up because the new owners do expect that. So I think if there's any way, sometimes you're just up against it and you can't, but you've seen it too. The sellers that are packing up last minute, the buyers that have a U-Haul, they came to the closing in a U-Haul because they have everything they own in a truck and they're headed to the house. So there's a lot of pressure with that. But I agree with you. We have so many amazing real estate agents that get it, that totally get it. And beyond that, they help facilitate connecting them with movers, with cleaners, with all of the services that are available and might not be as expensive as you may think if you look at the benefit of getting it done, not being so stressed out and bringing in some professionals to help you.
And like you said, that walkthrough is such a pivotal point in the process that like can set the tone that the closing is going to be really, really good and friendly and happy, or we could have a problem and some tension at the table.
Most definitely. And I think the last point I want to make for us as closers is a lot of times end of month, we are going from closing to closing to closing, and you sort of get into this groove. And I have had to remind myself many times throughout the years that I've done this to stop and give people the time to introduce each other, to talk about the house a little bit, because that seller that is feeling so sad about leaving the home they raised their family in, everything turns when the buyer starts asking about what's going to come up in the flower garden in the spring, and the seller gets to talk about something that maybe they refinished the hardwood floors, or they did something that they put a lot of work in that they have a lot of pride in. So I know that we have to stay on a schedule and you can only sort of allow so much time for that. But if there's any way that you can give the time for the buyers and sellers to make that connection, it just really brings down the temperature in the room.
I agree 100%. It's like you can feel a blanket being lifted off, right? When you have a minute to let everybody kind of get introduced and get connected. And I always do my best to also remind folks if we start to get a little bit too chatty that, you're going to have plenty of time after we've finished everything to continue this conversation. I don't want to rush anybody, but we do have a schedule to keep track of, and we'll have time at the end for you to continue to chat a little bit more about what's going on with the property once I'm making you guys copies and getting everything wrapped up. Just so cool to have everybody at the table and to be able to make those connections and have that discussion because we don't get to see it all the time anymore.
The best part of the job, really, because that's what all of the work points towards. That's the finish line. And to be a part of it is very, very special for the closers. Well, I hope this helped everybody to give just a little bit of insight and things to consider when they're working with that buyer that maybe seems super overwhelmed, or that seller that their sadness is maybe manifesting in the way of being uncooperative or being grouchy, because that happens too. But a lot of times when you really talk with them and look at the situation, there's a story behind it. And then once you realize what you're dealing with, you can find out how to support that client in the best way.
Absolutely. What's the saying? People are like onions. You got to peel back the layers a little bit to get to what's going on underneath. And also, don't forget, to our agents and our lenders and others that are listening, if somebody is high charge, super emotional one way or another, give us a call, give us a heads up, just having that knowledge prior to somebody walking in the door, we can go the extra mile to maybe try and diffuse that situation a little bit before somebody even sits down. That can help us prepare to, do our best to turn it around for them and to make it a really happy experience as much as we can.
That is great advice, and I think an awesome note to end this episode on. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Jess. I'm so happy that we're back together. We still have so many amazing topics to cover together on Behind the Title. And we hope that you will follow us on all of your listening platforms, that you'll share this episode. That is how we're going to be able to continue on and grow. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. We appreciate you.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Behind the Title, the official podcast of Trilogy and Baldacci Real Estate Closing Services with your hosts, Bobbie Grenier and Jessica Mongue. Remember, this podcast is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and not intended as legal advice. Please remember to follow and rate the show and share this episode with a friend.